Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. If you're really enjoying the show, please let your friends or your network know about it. It would be great to get this out to more people. Another thing that you could do is you could go to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating or review. That would greatly help us out. Thank you so much. In today's episode, we have a great conversation with Bryan Sims. Bryan and I get to work together in the MDNA training ecosystem team, in which we get to train others in the DNA of movements. It's great to be able to work with him. He is a fantastic man and fantastic trainer, coach, and somebody that is really passionate about seeing systems are created in such a way that produces generational fruits. It produces environments that people can change and grow. He's passionate about seeing people develop spiritually so that they could develop their leadership in a spiritual way, that we are spiritual people first. We have a wonderful conversation. I know that you're going to enjoy it. So here is Bryan Sims. Bryan Sims, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. It's good to be with you today.
Yeah, it's going to be good. When I was thinking about this, one of the questions that came up was just what has Jesus been teaching you lately?
Well, I think one of the things that I've been learning a lot is the importance of listening. And it's interesting. Even my spiritual director said to me not too long ago, I think the Lord wants to teach you how to trust him. And my first instinct when I heard that was like, it felt like, oh, am I 9 years old again?
Yeah.
And yet what's interesting is that learning how to see what the Father is doing and hear what the Father is speaking in deeper kinds of ways, what it means to truly abide in Jesus, what it means to be in step with the Spirit.
Yeah.
We're not any of us ever going to get to the end of that.
Yep. That's true.
And my life is busy. I have a lot of things going on. I try not to give in to the tyranny of the urgent, but there's a lot of stuff going on. 4 children, and all of them with activities and all kinds of ministry stuff going on. And it's all good stuff, but it can be a distraction from actually hearing the voice of the Lord. So I think that's actually one of the key elements right now for me.
Yeah, slowing down and hearing the voice of God is so important in everything that we do. And I think, there's a spiritual battle that happens when we try to do that, when we try to slow down. And it's a battle, I think, for people who go hard and go quick, and there's a lot of activity. Some of it has to do with identity issues of, who am I if I'm sitting and listening and not doing? Am I a being or a doer? How have you found this process for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's such a great question. And I had an opportunity to have a small sabbatical a few years ago. And I noticed that the world went on without me. And as a doer, as somebody who is involved in a lot of different ministry activities, it kind of hurt to start with. And then it was like, wait a minute, how much of my identity gets caught up in those sort of things instead of in Christ, and so it was actually really good for me. And it's part of that learning to trust process. It's like, does God really need me? And the beauty of it is, I mean, God has called us into mission. And yet this is Jesus' mission. As far as I can tell, he does not need my help. At the same time, he's invited me to play. He's invited us to play, to be a part of this with him. But we're not doing work for God. He doesn't need that. We're doing work with God. And that's one of the things that's changed for me. The older I get, is that shift of what it looks like to participate with and to see all ministry activity and, frankly, witness and everything else as just an ongoing part of my relationship with Jesus, as opposed to something I'm doing in ministry.
Yeah, that's huge. I've heard somebody talk about some of the most significant moments within Jesus and his disciples, and him speaking into them, really just happened as they were walking together, as they were journeying with, down the road, not when they were doing their so-called ministry activity. But calling Peter, saying, I'm going to build my house, my church upon you, the rock, and it's going to move. That's a pretty significant moment that I think happened on the road and as they were just journeying together. And so what are some of the things that we can learn from that as ministry leaders or people that are trying to make an impact for the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what struck me, Joshua, as you mentioned that, is just the Great Commission. And I mean, I grew up in, kind of context that really focused on missional activity, and I really appreciate that. But the main emphasis of the Great Commission was always go.
Yeah.
That was the imperative. And to actually study it a little deeper and understand that the imperative is make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And that the word go could just as easily be translated as you were going.
Yeah.
That this is supposed to be a part of who we are, a part of our life. And it's not a go out there and do something command. It's a make disciples command. And that as we are going, we're baptizing and we're teaching to obey, that these things complement that in that kind of way. And to see all of life as a response to God's grace and love and mercy, and to live in witness, in discipleship, in worship, in prayer, in obedience, that all of those are in response to, and it's part of our ongoing life with Jesus. And so not only trying to live that way myself, but finding ways, whether it would be with my family or with other leaders and other church contexts, ministry situations, to find ways to create the environment that fosters that kind of living with Jesus and others well, to model that, but also to invite others into that, and to help people be accountable to it. That's where the life is for me. That's what's most exciting in all of this.
Yeah. Have you found in your coaching of leaders and church planters over time, has there been a shift from we do this 9-to-5 ministry job into a shift of our total holistic view of what our life with Jesus is, that it's not a dichotomy, it's not a sacred secular divide or anything like that. It's just a holistic view. Yeah.
I actually have seen quite a bit of that over the last 20 years, Joshua. And I'd say, I'd blame John 15 for big parts of this picture of Jesus inviting us to abide in him in the same way that he abides in the Father, abide in his love in the same way he abides in the Father's love, to experience his complete joy, to demonstrate that we're his disciples, to be fruitful, to know the word, to ask for whatever we will and it be given to us. All of this is in the context of that relationship. And it's been really fun with ministry leaders who may have a 9-to-5 or 9-to-6 or 7 to 10 kind
usually
of
like
job.
a 70-hour-a-week job, but
exactly. But it's to shift that from being this is who I am. It's not just what I do, but it's actually it's just as much fun for me to watch that happen in teams where not only ministry, like vocational ministry leaders, like pastors and church planters, but also lay people who may have not ever been invited into that kind of life.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to have any special credentials to abide in Jesus.
Yep.
You might feel like you got to have special credentials to get up and preach a sermon or lead a group, but not to abide. But I mean, the beauty of that is that sometimes I see people who are far more fruitful as disciples of Jesus.
Yeah.
Who may or may not be the ones up preaching the sermons and leading the small groups.
Yep.
And the hope is, of course, getting those kind of folk up preaching the sermons, because it's coming out of a well of real life in their being, as opposed to just part of a job that I do. And I actually think, Joshua, it's one of the reasons why there are so many pastors and ministry leaders that burn out in the first few years. Because they've lost sight of the first love, but they also spend the vast majority of their time doing things that don't really represent their own sense of their own calling and giftedness and whatnot. And seeing that come together in a team of people, both what would be ministry leaders vocationally, as well as lay leaders who are passionate about their faith and following Jesus and giving this away to other people. That kind of synergy, that kind of that kind of sharedness is where the beauty is.
So how do you foster that? How do those things actually come together, and how do you get somebody to that place?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I've recognized in coaching ministry leaders is that it requires to start with some genuine humility, and a real deep commitment to the mission of Jesus.
Yeah.
More than just, I'm trying to build a church, or I'm trying to plant a church, or I'm trying to whatever, but to actually that shift in being to, this is Jesus' ministry. I've been invited to be a part of it, and I have something to offer, but not near enough.
Yeah.
I need others around me. That starting point of deep, what would be true union with Christ, like identity wrapped up in Jesus, that leads to humility, to kenosis, to the emptying of self and saying, this is not about me. This is about Jesus. It's about his mission. And I have value to bring in this. The Lord has given me gifts to bring to this. And I'm passionate about it, but I cannot do this alone. That's a starting place for me, because ministry leaders, especially positional leaders, whether in church plants, local churches, denominational groups, nonprofits, whatever it is, positional leaders are gatekeepers. And often they can block the move of the Spirit just by their own lack of self-awareness, or of the insecurity that comes from, if I ask for help, people will know I don't know everything. Well, which of us knows everything? I mean, but when that humility is there in a positional leader, then to invite others into covenantal relationship is one of the keys that we've experienced over the last 20 years, to say, what would it be like to be a part of Jesus' mission together? And what would being committed to Christ and to each other really look like? And to actually name some clear commitment and expectations that we would have of each other, rather than a positional leader like a pastor or a church planter saying, this is what I expect of you. Instead, creating the space to say, and it takes some vulnerability for those who are in positional leadership roles, but to create the space to say, what does commitment look like for you? What is non-negotiable for you? What would be, if you were going to be in the ideal kind of team environment where we were living in covenant and growing up into becoming more like Jesus and engaged in mission together, what would that environment look like? And actually to give people an opportunity to name it, to write it down, and to commit to something together that is shared. And when you can create that kind of space, then the key is holding people accountable to precisely what they say they already want. And so as a coach, creating that kind of space, but then the accountability of, did we do what we said we're going to do? I mean, that's integrity. If we said we're going to be committed to pray with one another, pray for one another, did we do that? And, it's interesting that it's so hard to have hard conversations in so many Christian environments. We feel like we're not being nice to look into each other's eyes and ask hard questions. But nice is not a fruit of the Spirit.
No, it's not.
Kindness is, gentleness is, but we got to be able to speak the truth in love. But if you create that kind of context from the beginning, where it's an expectation that part of what we're going to do is hold each other accountable to growing spiritually, to having healthy relationships with each other, but also to being on mission with Jesus together, then all of a sudden it changes the game, because, and it's not rocket science. I mean, accountability is so critical to all of that. But often, as a leader, I'm trying to hold people accountable to the precisely things that they asked for. And I'm asking them to hold me accountable to the things I asked for. That kind of relationship, that kind of covenant with one another, I think is one of the keys in terms of creating that kind of environment.
Have you seen any good examples of that you could see the transformation that happened within those environments?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a whole bunch. I think of one in particular. I had an opportunity to coach in a denominational setting, a local church that was dying and declining. They invited a couple other dying and declining churches to join them. And we went through a church planting process, but there's an existing group of people there. But they had lived isolated from one another, both in separate churches, as well as just within the same churches, isolated. The testimony that I'd love to share coming out of this, a woman named Marcia, who was in her mid-70s at the time. And she said to me, I was asking her about her experience in Covenant with this team. And she said, Brian, I've been in the church since I was a little girl. She grew up in church. In fact, she grew up in that same church building
Wow.
that she was still in. And she said, this is the first time anyone has ever asked me about my relationship with Jesus.
That is the saddest thing I've
And
heard.
it's kind of blew my mind. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, how have you been in a Christian church for
Yeah.
more than 70 years and nobody's ever? I said, if church wasn't about Jesus, what is church about? And she paused a second and then she said, church.
Mm.
And your response to me was my response to her.
Yeah.
It was one of the most profound moments for me. Like, church is important.
Yeah.
But, this is, to quote our friend Alan Hirsch, our ecclesiology ought to come from our missiology, which ought to come from our Christology. And in her case, they'd gotten it completely the other way around. It was the church. The identity was about the church, not about being in the family of Jesus and being on mission with Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's what gives us identity as a church. But what's interesting is that it was those covenantal relationships and being asked about her relationship with Jesus every week that transformed her life. But the beauty of it is she's now doing that with countless others. She's a lay woman, and now, 80 years old and making disciples everywhere she goes.
Wow.
Her whole life's about. She's got an apostolic calling on her life, but she didn't know it. And she'd been in church all along.
Wow.
Now, there was no magic in the kind of questions we were asking, the kind of things that I was doing with that team, but literally just inviting people into that kind of relationship with each other and with Jesus, and to be accountable to that changed her life.
Yeah.
And, to glory be to God.
Yeah. Well, at All Nations, we've entered into a social covenant together. We've definitely gone through a process like that and then written out a social covenant and had everybody sign it and said, this is how we agree to treat one another. This is how we agree to live with one another. This is what we want to do. And, and then supplemented that, we went through a process where, hey, with all of the staff of everybody that's here, let's come up with our own values. And we might want to kick out a value or two that was in the past. And we want to say, what are we committed to living to and living towards? And it's really helpful for all of us to be able to say, this is who we are. This is how we do it. And if you're not doing it, we can hold each other accountable for it and say, hey, let's move in this direction. And it actually really helps people define that and says, okay, I'm buying into this. I want to be a part of this. This is good. And it's a good thing. That accountability thing is huge, though. It's not, and it's something that Christians, for some reason, don't like to have accountability, when it seems like part of the ways of making disciples is to obey everything that Jesus taught, right? All of his commands. So if we're obeying his commands, we should be accountable to obey those commands. Even in John 15, Jesus says that if you obey my commands, you will abide in my love. Right. Like it goes hand in hand. It's love and obey. Love and obey goes hand in hand.
It does. It sure does. Well, and it's interesting to hear you name that because, one of the things that we love to do with teams after we get them into covenant and into accountable relationships, just built around their faith. And so it's those two pieces of accountability of what we call formational accountability, which is around how is it with your soul? How are we walking with Jesus? How are we abiding in Jesus? How are we listening to the Father? How are we in step with the Spirit? It's that formational accountability, but then the relational accountability of the covenantal kind of stuff. Yep. Are we living our commitments with each other? Are those commitments clear? Can we actually give a yes or no in terms of accountability? Yes, we lived this. Yes, no, we didn't. And then when we didn't, let's talk about it. I mean, it's not punitive in the sense of we're going to kick you out of this community the first time we met. I mean, this is humans living with humans. But the covenant itself creates the opportunity and something objective for us to actually look at and talk about together. So it's not personal.
Right.
We're actually just trying to be authentic, but then the same can be true missionally. But in order for us to be accountable to our mission, we have to be clear about what our core identity is about, what our mission, how we would define what that mission is, our purpose, but also, why we exist, but also to the point you just made, clarifying our values.
Yeah.
What is most important to us? What is non-negotiable? And in that, discerning the difference. And there are a lot of organizations that have clarity of their kind of aspirational values, their
Mm-hmm.
preferred values. If we were really being who we want to be, this is how we'd be.
Yeah.
But to also get clear on our lived values now. And in some cases, those things line up. But often, just like in our personal lives, they don't. And so, I mean, the illustration I often use around this in terms of values is I love to ask groups of people, how many of you own exercise equipment? Well, I mean, most Americans own some sort of exercise equipment. And
Yeah.
then
How many of you used
use
it? Yeah.
Yeah. And the first time I started asking this question, it's not long after my wife gave birth to twins. And as soon as they were big enough to actually start to move around, my son Silas would climb up on the bars of the elliptical machine and swing around. No humans actually getting on the thing to do what you're supposed to do on it, but he's getting some activity. We're hanging laundry on it. He's using it as monkey bars, but we're not using it for the purpose it's there for. And so there was an aspirational value of being in shape.
Yeah.
But in the midst of our exhaustion, our lived value was, I always describe for people, it's more like NCIS. It's like, I like this show, I'm going to watch this show, and I'd rather do this than work out.
Yeah.
And so, but that's a practical example of precisely what we do in teams and organizations as well. We have these aspirations about loving our neighbors, for instance, or something that clearly, who's going to argue with that? Those are Jesus' words, and it's been true all throughout Scripture. But are we actually doing it? Mm-hmm. And so to have enough trust, to have the right kind of covenantal environment, and have enough trust that we're able to actually look in each other's eyes and say, okay, this is what we want to value. And let's preach our sermons on that. Let's teach about this. Let's do, because you need to, but to also be able to be authentic about the gap between where we are now and where we want to be as it relates to those aspirational values. And as I see it, that gap between our existing reality and those aspirational values it directly mirrors the gap between where we are now and the kind of vision that we have for the future. Those things mirror each other, and that gap is always going to be there. But ideally, we're closing that gap with every passing day, as we're walking with Jesus, as we're walking with each other, as we're going on mission with Jesus, as we're being accountable to actually living out those values. But if we don't ever articulate them, and if we don't articulate the difference between where we are and where we're headed, it's really hard to make progress. And in terms of just processes, I love to say to people, it's really hard to get somewhere from nowhere if you don't know where you already are. And what's interesting is that most places have a clear sense, or at least some intuitive sense of aspirational values and a vision for the future, what their future state might be. But if you're not also clear on what's true now, there's no way to move from here to there. It's kind of guesswork. Like, it feels like this could help us. But if you have a clear sense of where you are, it's like the "you are here" dot on a giant map. It's like, well, we know our destination, we know where we are, we can start to move in that direction. And the danger, of course, in it is that we can put all the onus on, it's all about our planning and our strategies and all that. No, fruitfulness comes through abiding in Jesus. We have to stay clear on that. At the same time, there is when we are intentional about the kind of environments we create and the kind of processes we follow, then we tend to make progress. And that's how those kind of questions and that kind of discernment of where are we, where is God calling us to be, what experiments might we need to try next, those are all questions that the Spirit can utilize to bring us discernment on how to take a next step and actually be engaged in mission in a way that's fruitful. So
as we're walking towards closing the gap and we're getting to the place of vision, aspirational values, measurement, I think, is important. So are we measuring where we're at and how do we get there? How do we measure process goals or vision and value? How do you measure that? A lot of people can measure, numbers, like how many people came into the door, how many, all these numbers. But really, how do we measure a thing that's really the core to who we are and probably the most important thing to get right?
Yeah. It's a great question. And it's obviously, it's a whole lot easier to measure nickels and noses,
Yep.
how many dollars in the plate, and how many people showed up. And those can be helpful indicators, but they can also be deceptive indicators.
Right.
If what we're after is spiritual health, is transformation, is formation, is witness, those kinds of things. And so how do we get at that? And once again, being clear on what you're hoping for is really important. And that's like long-term kind of vision. But one of the things we often really encourage people toward is to think about over the next 6 months, what would be, what's a stretch, but not a leap in terms of a goal, something that we would target. So let's say, we're in a church plant, and right now we've got 10% of our people that are in weekly accountable relationships. We might say by the end of the year, in the next 6 months, we'd like to get to 20%. And we're not saying, we're at 10 and we're going to get to 80. That's probably unrealistic, but we're also not saying we're at 10 and we're going to get to 11. It's something that stretches us enough, but that is what, organizational theorists will call a lagging indicator, because we're not going to see it change overnight.
Yep.
The result itself is actually lagging, which means the lagging part is that whatever action, if there's something cause and effect that happens there, whatever action that led to whatever this effect is happened in the past far enough that, and so if we're planning toward that, we have to think about what is often referred to as a leading indicator as well as a lagging indicator. Lagging is, that's that goal of like, we want to get from 10 to 20% by the end of the year. And the key is to name something specific enough that we can tell if we're making progress.
Yep.
But the leading indicator that's actually the actions we're going to take.
Yeah.
And that's what we hold each other accountable to. And so the language we love to use is you measure the result, but you manage the actual strategy. That's what you hold people accountable to. And so, because ultimately we know the fruit is in God's hands. And when we're talking about reaching people, for instance, I mean, most of us think people have some say in this too, that there's at least a measure of free will that we have as humans.
Yeah, that's right.
And that clearly God's not just making us do things. And so if that's the case, then God's the one bringing the fruit. But we also have to recognize that sometimes we're in seasons where people are receptive and sometimes we're not. And we have to pay attention to that too. But having an indicator, a benchmark like that we can strive toward, that we can move toward, can actually be helpful for us, can motivate action in the present. And so, as I love to say, vision doesn't change the future. Having a clear vision and even a clear goal of something in the future, it doesn't change the future. It changes the present. It changes the way we live today if we actually care about that. And so if we want, in that scenario I just played, if we want to get more people into small groups because we think that this strategy, it can actually be formative for people becoming fully devoted, reproducing disciples of Jesus. If we think that could be important, then having a goal of, we want to get to 20% by the end of the year allows us to operate differently now. And then we have to name, what are we going to do differently now? We can't just expect it, just bump along like we've been doing and anything's going to change. That, once again, definition of insanity. But to say, what could we do differently now that might lead to more people wanting to be in our small groups, or any other strategy for that matter, and that would relate to our overall values and vision as a church. And so that particular example for me, then once again, it relates back to this missional accountability to be able to say, hey, it's pretty easy for us to name, a few potential strategies, but then to hone in on maybe one and say, well, the first thing we need to do is train up some new small group leaders.
Yeah.
Great. We can do that between now and next month. And if we get that done and we do it well, then maybe those folks are launching new groups and maybe we have the opportunity to get to this goal by the end of the year. Could be the same if reaching new people, starting a new missional community, whatever it is. But most of those kinds of things have a lagging kind of indicator. And to be able to think about what do we do now that might actually lead toward that longer term fruit that we're looking for. And it's a way to measure that. The other thing for me is this is one of these things where I love shared leadership. None of us as leaders is smart enough to figure all of that out by ourselves. That's true. So especially if you've got teams that have kind of APES diversity of apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, where we're not all the same in there. to be able to actually look at this kind of problem, like how to measure fruitfulness together with that kind of diversity. We're all on the same mission. We're passionate about it. We're in covenant together, but we're all going to look at this same problem from different angles, and we're likely to come up with a better solution. This is adaptive leadership, and it's it happens best in team. And that shifts then, and I mentioned this a little while ago, of even starting with, you got to, as a positional leader, you got to have enough humility to invite others into this with you. But the same is true with not only inviting people into covenant, but inviting people into mission, and being able to say, I don't actually know the best way to do this by myself.
Yeah.
And that is really hard for some of us as leaders, but to admit that, to be vulnerable in that kind of way, but then the freedom that comes from us working on it together. But it's not just freedom. And it's the joy actually that comes when we start to resemble. I mean, I think about Ephesians 4, and I mean, I mentioned APEST, but if I catch on to Paul's vision in this, that we would equip the saints for the work of ministry and exhibit the same kind of unity and maturity that we see within the Trinity, that we are the fullness of Christ in the world.
That's amazing. Yeah.
That's what we're after.
Yeah.
But we don't get unity and maturity by accident.
Right.
It's the Spirit's work for sure.
Yeah.
But we don't get it by accident. We get it by modeling the way, by creating the right kind of environments, and by having the kind of processes that help us move from here to there, knowing that all along the way, only God brings the fruit. Yeah.
You mentioned adaptive leadership. I think I was talking to my cousin's husband. He's a professor at Boise State University, and he's in his microbiology department. They are rejigging their whole curriculum, and they're trying to figure out, how do we teach people today for the problems that'll happen 20 years from now? And that's the whole question, right? Because you just don't want to teach about what we know now. We want to teach people how to handle the challenges that come in the future. How do we, as Christian leaders, as people trying to equip the saints for the works of the ministry, how do we equip others for the challenges that will happen in 10, 20 years down the road?
The first thing, Joshua, that pops into my head is the scene in Acts chapter 6. Because we have a challenge in Acts 6 that, as far as I can tell, the church had not faced yet.
Mm-hmm.
Acts 2, 3, 4, 5, they've got sharing everything in common. And I mean, the church is expanding, growing, daily, those who are being saved, and beautiful things are happening.
Yeah.
In Acts 6, we get this first kind of cultural crisis, and they bring the problem to the apostles. And what most of us would do as leaders is we would solve the problem for that day.
Right.
And often we would do so as a demonstration of our authority. Like, I'm the positional leader here. It's kind of my job to do this. Sometimes, if we're insecure, we might do it as a way to demonstrate our own competency. Like, hey, look, I really do belong here as a leader. What the apostles do in Acts chapter 6 is really interesting. They give the problem back to the people. But they set a standard. Choose amongst yourselves those who are full of the Spirit and wisdom.
Yeah.
And so it's not just, we don't care, y'all figure this out. No, I think the apostles cared deeply about what was going on. But I think they recognized, and I think this is Spirit's discernment in them together. I think they recognized that they were not the right people to make this decision. But I also wonder if they recognized that if they made that decision, they're going to have to make the next one too. And the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. And what happens instead is that we have a whole new set of leaders raised up. We already, by Acts chapter 6, we have a multicultural church, but we only have Jewish leaders.
Wow.
But when Acts chapter 6 happens, all those deacons that are raised up in Acts chapter 6, they have Greek names. And all of a sudden we have multicultural leadership in a multicultural church. And before long, the center of Christianity has shifted from Jerusalem to Antioch.
Yeah.
I think every bit of that is a result of that decision in Acts 6. And I think it's precisely what you're describing. Instead of our leaders are going to solve this for us, which I think is what the Hellenists wanted when they brought the problem to the apostles. Hey, we pay you for this. You fixed it. Now they probably weren't getting paid. But I mean, this is the sentiment in most local churches right now, but it's the same is true in a biology department at Boise State University. We expect the experts to solve the problems. The problem is with that, two things. One, many of the problems we're facing right now, the experts don't even know how to solve. That's the definition of an adaptive challenge. But even if we do have some insight into that, if we hog the decisions, if we hoard the leadership in those scenarios, those of us with positions of leadership, then we'll be expected to do the same the next time this comes around. And if we can find ways, part of equipping is actually training people what to do. And part of equipping is actually giving people enough responsibility to learn their way forward. And if Ron Heifetz is right, and I tend to agree with him on a lot of things as it relates to adaptive leadership, but leadership is primarily about learning and creating the kind of environment, the kind of capacity for learning around us. And so if we're going to train people now to solve the problems of 2 years from now and 5 years from now and 10 and 20 years from now, then we have to be willing to let go of some of our authority and share that with somebody else. And we do that in calculated ways. We moved a couple of years ago and we consulted with our children on our move, but they didn't make the decision. As parents, we made the decision. They weren't ready for that yet, but we did give them some responsibility in it, but no authority. They weren't ready for that. But if now I have a senior in high school, if I haven't started trusting him with those kind of things by now, he's going to get out in the quote unquote real world a year from now, which, I'm both excited about and scared about, by the way. But he's going to get out in the real world and he's not going to know how to make decisions. And so we've been trying to train him not what to do, but how to make the right kind of decisions, how to discern the voice of the Lord, how to listen to wise counsel, how to test things and know whether the Lord might be in it, rather than just, take a leap into the whole thing all at once. And so, but that's an example of, how do we solve the problems of, that will be in the next generation? My fear is that if we keep solving them, those of us that have quote unquote power now, they're never going to learn. And what they're going to do, and this is what I think we keep seeing this from one generation to the next, we just keep swing the pendulum way over here and then swing the pendulum way over here. And it's what, and it's not just generation to generation. It's literally like every few years, we're swinging the pendulum over and over and over. And I think it's this notion of whoever's in charge, whoever the expert is supposed to know how to solve these problems. And here's the secret. Nobody knows how. The world's changing too fast.
It is.
Means we've got, the key to equipping people, first and foremost, it's about equipping in, abiding in Christ and being in step with the Spirit, hearing the voice of the Father and this kind of stuff, seeing what the Father is doing. But in concert with that, to actually, one of my goals when I'm training folks, and I do this both in training seminary students as well as in equipping in local churches, is my goal is not for you to get the right answer. My goal is for you to learn how to learn. Because you're going to face another challenge next week. And if all I did was help you get the answer to this, that doesn't help you next week. But if you learned how to learn and discern, then next week, you're going to have the confidence to face that one as well. And it's one of the things that I think COVID has been such a good teacher. And I wouldn't wish this on anybody. And I do not think God was the author of it. But the gift to going through a pandemic is that most of us see that things had to change. And whether we wanted to change or not, and even if what we were doing before was successful, we're having to find new ways to do things now and let go of some old ways. But also, the key in this is that if we can learn how to discern in a season like this, what else are we ever going to face that's going to be harder than this? And that's part of it for me, is if people can have the confidence to hear the voice of the Lord, but also to listen to one another, to listen to their community, and to learn how to discern what the Spirit is saying to the church right now. As they said in Acts 15, to discern what seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. mean, it's a shared kind of leadership experience. But if we can learn how to discern in that kind of way in the middle of a pandemic, then we can discern that kind of way in anything. And that for me will be the gift for the next generation, is less of, hey, we learned the content of what to do in blah situation. Well, what if that situation never happens again?
Yeah.
The key is to learn how to learn, to gain what Ron Heifetz would call adaptive capacity. It's the ability to learn in the middle of a challenge and keep growing and keep moving, keep embodying your values. And in those seasons to get clearer and clearer on the things that will never change.
Right.
Because everything else is changing. And if we're really clear on those values, we can stick to that even in the changing storms.
Yeah, that reminds me that it's just like learning to trust the Lord now for you. It's the same thing as we're learning to trust the Lord, that he's going to speak in these situations, that it's not all on us. We can give it to him. He can be the author, and he could do it, and he could make that change. And it also reminds me of Exodus 18 when Jethro comes to Moses and says, "Moses, you idiot, you've been trying to solve all these problems for millions of people, and you're not getting anything accomplished. Nothing's happening. And so divide people into tens, 50s, hundreds, and thousands and put people in charge of them and those types of things." And so people have responsibility all the way down into the tens. I mean, there's a shepherd over a group of 10 people. And, that's where people can start to learn to make decisions, to exercise that. If they don't know what to do, what do? They go up to the guy that's in charge of the 50s. And then if he doesn't know, they go up to the guy who's in charge of the hundreds. And then it go up and down the line. And I think in that scenario, as we're really sharing leadership, as we're making sure that everybody is accountable to somebody and everybody has a place in this move of God, this as we're wandering in the desert or doing whatever we're doing, then we're taken care of. We can solve problems. We can go to people if we don't know what to do. And Jesus could speak in the midst of all of it.
Yeah, it's so true. And what's interesting hearing you describe it that way, Joshua, is that, what seems so elusive when we're in difficult, challenging situations and circumstances is to actually experience focus and joy. And yet they're actually in the midst of those kind of liminal spaces.
Yeah.
Like the wilderness.
Yep.
That's the place of greatest transformation.
Yeah.
It was for Moses.
Yeah.
It was for God's people. It is for all of us. Mm-hmm. And we want those seasons to go away, like the one we're in now. Yeah. We want it to go away. It's like, when are we going to be past this? It's like I was already using the language of post-COVID, and then 3 of my children got COVID. I'm like, apparently we're not post-COVID. But in the midst of the wilderness that we're in,
yep.
Or another metaphor, like a winter instead of merely a snowstorm, a blizzard,
right.
Andy Crouch and others pointed to. It's actually in the middle of these seasons, if we are receptive, that the Spirit can do the greatest work in us.
That's true.
But that we actually can be a witness to a different way in the midst of circumstances like this. Because certainly it's these kind of circumstances promote anxiety and stress.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the crazy thing for me is that, like, a season we've been in, it's leveled the playing field. It's like believer and non-believer are going through the same thing together. You want to talk about incarnational opportunity, proximity, and we're like in the middle of this together. And people are stressed. And if they see something different, if somehow we experience the joy of the Lord in the midst of our challenges, it doesn't mean we're not stressed. It doesn't mean we're not afraid. It doesn't mean we're like everything's all hunky-dory. I mean, this is hard.
Yeah.
But if we actually can experience something deep in the midst of this kind of season, and that we share that in a community. I mean, this is one of the reasons for me. I think, in Acts 2, 3, 4, along in there, Like the non-believers are like breaking the doors down to be a part of
Right.
the early church.
Yep.
But who wouldn't if there was no need among you? I mean, that's what's going on there. Not
Yeah.
only is the Holy Spirit moving, but I'm looking at this going, you want to tell, we've one of the only times in human history where a group of people actually loved one another well. Well, who wouldn't want to be a part of that, especially in the middle of crisis,
Mm-hmm.
But that's precisely what Jesus has called us to.
Yeah.
And that's the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. I mean, that's not unheard of.
Mm.
And it's precisely in these kind of seasons where more of that kind of fruit ought to show up in our lives because more people need it.
Yeah.
But it becomes a challenge because sometimes it's in the hard stuff when the true stripes show in all of us. And we don't look as much like Jesus as we thought we did. So.
Yeah. There's a couple questions I like to ask at the end, but I want to ask one more before we get there. And this is, how do I say this? People who are not paid professional Christians, if we're having this shared leadership, if things are working across the board, if we're splitting people up into tens and 50s, hundreds and thousands, what's going to happen is we have a lot of bivocational people. We have people that this isn't their main job, but they're caring for people, and they're, people are in their homes. It's a lot of responsibility and work. Have you seen anything that's helped them walk this process to being able to do that well and not burn out and say, I'm tapping out, I'm done, this is too much for me?
Well, I mean, one of the things for me, we talked about equipping a few minutes ago, but I think unfortunately we give people more than they're ready for too soon, and nobody's ever ready. Which means, so it's that fine line of give people slightly more than they're ready for, but you still have to equip them. One of the things that's most disempowering in those kind of situations, for whether it's lay people or bivocational kind of people, it's not the workload. It's actually being asked to do something that they don't know how to do. And when you're not equipped to do something, then, and I used to use I teach on leading change quite a bit. And, if a personality like mine sees, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those whiteboards that is 60 feet long.
Yeah.
Like a blank 60-foot whiteboard is like, oh, I mean, I'm like so excited, like we can create something.
Yeah.
But that's paralyzing to most people.
Yeah, it is.
Most people, when they're given the blank sheet to create something or go off and lead something, they want to go cry or lock themselves in a hole,
Yeah.
Instead of being empowering, which is the intention often of those of us that have spiritual authority to actually give permission to lead. If someone has not been equipped to lead, then how can you walk beside them and help equip them? And sometimes it's a matter of just saying, hey, you know what? You're going to have to take a leap, but I'm going to be here with you. But it's not a just send you off to, experiment by yourself kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other side of that is, to do it in team. And this is one of the fascinations to me, is that most people, if we're going to give somebody responsibility for something, it's just solo kind of stuff. It's like, okay, I want you to lead blah class. Now go and do it. And they're on their own.
Yeah.
Instead of, when Jesus sent people out, he sent them 2 by 2.
Right.
And, it's a small team, but that's a team, to say there is a courage and an empowerment and a confidence, as well as a vulnerability that I have somebody to talk to when we do it together. But if I'm having to lead something by myself, it's actually little wonder why people get so burned out so fast. The flip side of that, on the practical side too, is if I'm leading with someone and I need to take a week off, or I've got some family commitment that I need to keep that is in conflict with this, I can say, hey, you got the ball this week. And we can, it's the practicality of sharing leadership. It's not only do we have multiple perspectives and, together we're able to actually, there's a synergy where it's greater than the sum of the parts. And the whole Ecclesiastes cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. I mean, all of those things are true, but it's also the practicality of, I don't have to carry near as much weight when I got somebody on my team carrying part of it too. And what's fascinating is that we recognize this and applaud it in so many other sectors. We have an orchestra and we let everybody plays their own instrument, and every once in a while there's a solo or whatever, but it's about the whole thing, the symphony sounding together. That's what symphony stands for, sounding together. We watch it in a sporting event. It's like, you might like the heroics of one person that's better than everybody else, but those kind of teams don't win championships.
Right.
The teams that win championships have a synergy. They have something that's greater than the sum of the parts, and no one person has to carry all the load.
Yep.
And yet, for some reason in ministry, we've been using this model for such a long time that if anything good's going to come, I'm going to have to do it myself. Well, it's not the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
But it's also just practically, it's not sustainable. And not only not sustainable, it's not replicatable.
Right.
And so that's what I would say is being intentional about equipping, but also that as you're equipping, don't do things by yourself. And don't invite others that you're equipping to do things by themselves. Make sure that people are doing stuff, if nothing else, in pairs or in teams in some sort of way, because it has the opportunity to replicate, but also we get the practicality of sharing the load with each other in ways that allow it to be more life-giving and more sustainable, more multipliable over time.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. So if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Wow. What advice would I give? I would lean into mentors more. It's one thing I would do. My 21-year-old self knew more than I know now, which of course is not actually true, but I thought it was true.
Yep.
The older I get, the wiser I become, the more time that I have on this life, the more I know I don't know.
Yeah.
And so I think, that's one piece of advice. The other piece for me, there is a, I don't remember where it comes from, but that the language of, I think this is in the movie, We Bought a Zoo, but this notion of a moment's courage is often all it takes.
Yeah.
It's something that I have learned throughout the years that, I'd love to be the kind of person that was never afraid again. But my discovery is that that's human nature. Yeah. And in fact, a lot of psychologists would say that our fears are related to our greatest loves.
Yeah.
And so the only way to not be afraid is to not love anything or anyone.
Yeah.
And I'm a passionate person, which means I'm going to be afraid. Because I care a lot. I care a lot about Jesus. I care a lot about my family. I care a lot about other people knowing Jesus.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get burned. And I've been betrayed. I've been hurt. I've been, and all those kind of things. But that notion of a moment's courage, and that moment's courage comes from love. It's that love is the antithesis of fear, not courage. What I need more of is love.
Yeah.
And that when I love more, which of course is that I received more.
Yep.
I love because I've first been loved, but I wish I'd been taught that in Sunday school, but I wish I could go back to my 21-year-old self and say, this is the secret.
That's good.
Be loved well, know who you are, but then to love well means that in those moments of courage, because I don't see myself, and frankly, I'm not around a lot of leaders that are courageous all the time, or even a lot of the time, or even most of the time.
Right.
Most of us are scared more than we're courageous.
Yeah.
But I think that was actually true in the book of Acts. I think they were scared more than they were courageous, but they were bold because of the Spirit's filling in them.
Yeah.
And so I think the motivation for them then is precisely what I'm saying now.
Yeah.
Those moments of courage and boldness is because they were overcome with love for the other, as opposed to just, being afraid or, whatever my selfish motivations might be. So I think those are two things that I'd probably go back and, it's about humility. It's about love. So.
Yeah, that's good. That's good for you to realize that. And hopefully if we realize it, the sooner the better. Our life is going to be much, much better. My wife, one of her favorite movies is We Bought a Zoo, and she wanted to watch that a lot back before Luke was born. We got to bring that back out. Watch We Bought a Zoo again.
Yeah.
Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Well, I'm actually reading Tempered Resilience by Todd Bolsinger. I'd certainly recommend anything by Todd Bolsinger. But that one is up on my Kindle right now. And that the what it looks like to lead through hard stuff, and frankly to live through and love through, but to lead through hard stuff, I think is really timely. And I know he wrote that before the pandemic happened. It came out after, but he'd already done the work on it. And so that wasn't related to the pandemic, but it's so timely. And so that's one piece for me. The other thing, I guess that I would name in all of this is that the older I get, I used to read a whole lot more leadership books, and I still read leadership books.
Yeah.
But I spend more of my time reading formation stuff by folks like Ruth Haley Barton and Dallas Willard.
Yeah.
And the like that is and so those are the things that are on my constant review. I mean, I went back through Ruth Haley Barton's Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership just last week. For that very reason, because it's easy to strengthen the skill of your leadership and the soul of your leadership to be weak. And I think she's onto something, and others like her. The other thing that I just finished reading is Rich Villodas' new book called The Deeply Formed Life. Rich took over as the senior pastor of, I think it's called New Life Community Church up in New York, where Pete Scazzera was formerly the pastor.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful succession story, but Rich's own story of how his life has been deeply formed, but what it looks like to work that into a community of faith is really powerful. The rhythms that he suggests in that particular book. So those are some things just in the last couple of months. So
those are really good. So where can people find you if they want to connect with you for anything? How can they find you?
Yeah, so a couple different ways. First off, my website is just BryanDSims.com. So BRYAN, middle initial D is David, Sims, SIMS. So BryanDSims@gmail.com is my email address, but BryanDSims.com is my website. And I've got some resources up there. I've got a book coming out in the next couple months here with 100 Movements Publishing on shared leadership called Leading Together, that really focuses on a number of the things that we've been talking about over the last hour. And would be glad to connect with folks. Those are probably the easiest ways to get a hold of me.
Excellent. That's great. Well, Bryan, it was a privilege to talk to you. Thank you so much. It was really good.
Thank you, Joshua. So good to be with you today. Thanks for this opportunity.
All right. Bye.